you should have just gotten a notification. It may ask you to click that yes, you consent to recording. Everyone looks like we're feeling good. Terrific. So we'll just jump right on into that agenda. Please join me in welcoming Cleo Necule, the TMDL lead for RIA 9. She'll be giving us an overview of the Suze Creek Bioassessment TMDL and some updates on the temperature dissolved oxygen TMDL. Cleo, you can go ahead and begin sharing your screen whenever you're ready. And as you do, I'm just gonna keep talking so there's no quiet. Suze Creek, of course, as y'all know, is the Green's largest trib and it's important salmon habitat. Its temperatures regularly exceed water quality standards, but it also has great restoration and revegetation potential. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Cleo.
Thank you, Iris. Can you see my screen?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. And you can hear me okay. All
yep.
right. Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. Good morning. I am Cleo Necule, Ecology's TMDL lead for RIA 9. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the Suze Creek TMDL that addresses impairments for benthic invertebrates. But first, I want to thank the ITC for the opportunity to present on this project. This will be the first public presentation in a series of presentations that you may be part of or you'll hear about in the next year or so. To give you an idea of what I'll be touching on, the points that I'll be touching on today, as Iris mentioned, I will give you a brief update on the Suze temperature dissolved oxygen TMDL. And then I'll pivot the discussion to the benthic invertebrates and talk about what it means to have a water body that doesn't meet water quality standards for benthic invertebrates. And also then talk to you about what it means to have, what are the policy implications for how to deal with these impairments. After that, I plan on going briefly over some project history. I plan on keeping it kind of like high level because in the interest of time, but if you'd like to know more, then we can do that during the Q&A or one-on-one meetings. I'd be happy to do that as well. After that, I think that the discussion will set up to this point, we'll set up us nicely to discuss the conceptual approach for developing the Suze TMDL, what kinds of information we can expect from the TMDL, and how that information will inform actions that are needed for restoration. So before I move on to the presentation on the benthic part of the TMDL, I want to give you a brief update on the temperature and dissolved oxygen. The initial model that was developed by Tetra Tech and the EPA showed that temperature standards could be met if the riparian buffer is restored. The dissolved oxygen concentrations could also benefit from the riparian restoration, but due to high flow inputs from wetlands, the DO concentrations were expected to remain below the standard. But policy and legal changes focused on situations in which water bodies are not expected to meet water quality standards, even after full implementation. So that would be the case of Suze for dissolved oxygen, then delayed us from finalizing the temperature DO portion of the TMDL. And last year, we collected additional data at the fish hatchery to understand if the new hatchery has any impacts on the temperature and dissolved oxygen downstream from it. We collected data at 4 locations, as you can see here on the map. One was right upstream of the intake of the hatchery to understand what the temperature and dissolved oxygens are right when before the water comes into the hatchery, then intake, a little bit downstream, and at the mouth with the Green River. So when we looked at the data, we realized that we have a problem. What you see here in the top graph is the raw data that we collected at 2 of those 4 sites that I just showed you on the map. One of the sites would be the site that was upstream of the fish hatchery and the other one downstream of it. And the bottom graph shows the same data, but normalized for the 7-day average daily max, which is what we use for the water quality standard. In some streams in the state, the water quality standards for temperature are divided between a summer temperature standard, which is usually 16 degrees Celsius, and you see it represented here by this top red line. But then also a supplemental standard that is meant to protect salmon spawning and rearing, which is 13 degrees. You see it represented here by this broken red line, because the supplemental spawning criterion applies between September 15th and July 1st. So when we looked at the data that we collected at the hatchery, we realized that during the shoulder periods, and especially during the second half of June, the gap between the current conditions and the criterion is so great that probably planting a riparian buffer and restoring it would be insufficient to fill in this gap. At the same time, the data and the model that we've been working with, we believe that we're insufficient to explain what the extent, the extent to which these differences are due to anthropogenic impacts or just natural conditions. So we discussed internally how to move forward, and we decided to go back and collect new data and use those into as inputs to a model that meets current modeling standards and reevaluate the impacts of development versus natural conditions. We are at the point now when we are finishing up the planning process for the project, and then we'll bring it forward later in the fall to our management for reapproval. I'm going to leave it at that for now, and we can talk more, like I said, during the Q&A if you'd like to, but I just want to say that I know that this is deeply disappointing and frustrating to get to this point in the project after so many years, to get to the point where we have to collect new data and restart the project. Honestly, I am past the grieving point for now, and I'm mostly excited to have the opportunity to build a project together with our environmental assessment program and stakeholders like you, members of the RIA, to be able to address temperature and dissolved oxygen impairments in a way that is tailored more towards an urban or suburban watershed. And part of why that's possible is because of all the work that we've done for the benthic TMDL. So now I will move on and focus the rest of my presentation on the benthic TMDL. As I mentioned before, I won't go into many details about the history of the project, which started about 15 years ago. I just want to mention that it was born out of discussions between the EPA, Ecology, and King County's science group. It was meant to be, and it still is, the first TMDL in Washington for waters that don't meet a certain BIBI threshold. And if you are new to benthic invertebrates, BIBI stands for Benthic Index of Biotic Integrity. So you may wonder why it's important to have a TMDL that addresses these impairments. The idea was that more conventional parameters that you see listed among water quality standards are not sufficient to address stormwater impairments. And since stormwater permits focus mostly on new and redevelopment, we need a tool to help us control the degradation in urban streams from older development. Now, the more recent permits are starting to turn their focus towards some retrofits, but probably not sufficient at this point. BIBI is monitored across the state, as you can see from this map that I got from the Puget Sound stream benthos. And monitoring is, in general, is focused on certain types of invertebrates. So not all invertebrates are equal. The invertebrates that monitoring usually focuses are taxa like mayflies, caddisflies, stoneflies, but also some snails, clams, and others. One reason why benthic invertebrates are so useful in signaling a problem is because different groups of invertebrates can be sensitive to different types of pollutants. So the presence or the absence or the abundance of certain species can give us a jump start on understanding which groups of pollutants to look for. In Washington, as you can see from this map, things range from very poor to excellent. And as you can see, there are some problems in Eastern Washington. Those are most likely due to agriculture. But in Western Washington, the poor scores for BIBI are clustered around the heavily urbanized areas. In this case, the BIBI scores become an indicator of urbanized watershed health. And the emphasis is on indicator because even though the scores point to a problem, they do not identify the source of the problem. You can think of monitoring benthic invertebrates as taking the blood pressure of a stream. We go to the doctor and the doctor takes our blood pressure, and if it's too high, it sends a signal that something in our body is not functioning correctly, but not necessarily what is not functioning. So she might order us to undergo a series of tests to understand the causes of high blood pressure. In watershed science, the equivalent of these tests is a stressor ID analysis. The analysis gathers available information from multiple locations in the watershed, for whatever locations we have data for. It also looks at reference streams located in settings that are similar to the watershed in question. And then with all of these data, it does a statistical analysis to narrow down the most likely causes of impairment. But to do that, you first have to understand what a set of factors could affect the BIBI, just like the doctor would probably prescribe a set of tests that most likely get to the causes of the high blood pressure, like a blood test. To do that, we had to do one of these stressor ID analyses in Sioux, which was done around 2016. The analysis looked at a series of factors that other studies had pointed out, so literature had pointed out at affecting benthic invertebrates to narrow down the likely causes of impairments that are particular to Sioux. A systematic approach that the stressor ID followed was based on investigation of causal pathways for impairment. And it asked questions like, does the stream have a healthy riparian habitat? Riparian buffers don't just provide shade and cool water, they also provide food for the invertebrates. Another question was, does the stream have clean water that is free of pollutants like metals, nutrients, but also temperature and dissolved oxygen concentrations? Another question is the gravel in the stream mostly free of fine sediment? If not, erosion that results in fine sediment can smother the invertebrates. Does the stream exhibit complexity, or is it mostly urban stream that has been straightened and widened and lacks any kind of complexity like riffles and pools? And then last but not least, have impervious surfaces led to a significant change in the hydrograph where even small rain events result in high peak flows? To answer these questions, like I said, we performed this, and when I say we, I mean ecology and the EPA actually performed this stressor ID analysis that looked at initial sites that formed the basis for the TMDL, but also other sites for which we had data later. The sites that were identified as impaired earlier and became the reason why we started the TMDL are shown here as stars on this map. And then the sites that were added later during the stressor ID analysis are shown as dots. As I mentioned, data from both groups of sites were considered for the stressor ID. How well or not well the benthic invertebrates are doing is represented in this qualitative scale, ranging from very poor, symbolized with the dark red dots, all the way to excellent, the dark blue dots. But what I want you to keep in mind is that anything that is fair or below does not meet water quality standards. So when we look at the map, we notice two things. First, that the problem is systemic, but that the range of severity ranges from fair, which is still impaired, but not bad, all the way to severely impaired in a couple of spots here in the Meridian, Valley Creek, and in the upper Sioux. The second thing we notice, hopefully you can see these two blue dots, one in Covington and one in the lower Big Sioux, are blue, meaning that the benthic invertebrates are actually doing well in these areas. I take this as a sign that if we are proactive in addressing these impairments in a timely manner, we can restore the benthic invertebrates in Sioux. So what were the findings of the stressor ID? The analysis pointed at three likely causes of impairment in the Sioux. The first one is high pulse counts, which is a parameter that indicates that high flows associated with stormwater negatively impact the invertebrates. A high pulse count is an occurrence where the hydrograph peaks at a value that is twice as high as average annual flows. The second likely cause is fine sediment, both coming from the watershed and produced in stream from erosion. But in both cases, they are the result of high runoff due to impervious surfaces. And finally, habitat degradation, which gets at some of the areas that I mentioned before, including riparian habitat and lack of channel complexity. Since these findings are based on a statistical analysis and not a causal model, I want to emphasize again that they are considered most likely stressors. And at this point, we're happy to see these three factors identified, which are crucial in helping us forge a path toward the TMDL. But TMDLs exist at this intersection between science and policy, and that can make for so that things maybe don't move as straightforward as we would like them to. In this case, legal challenges in other states and Clean Water Act provisions about what is considered a pollutant determined us to make a decision that we cannot do a TMDL in terms of flow, so high pulse counts are out, and that we cannot do a TMDL for habitat degradation, so that is out too, and we're left with sediment. What does it mean to have a sediment, a fine sediment TMDL? Does it mean that we're abandoning stormwater? And the answer is absolutely not, because all roads to sediment go through stormwater. What this means is that to get to sediment, we must absolutely and necessarily address stormwater. What you see here is an overall representation of what happens to in-stream flows when development is introduced in a watershed. You've probably seen this picture tons of times before, but I wanted to include it here because I want to remind you of what happens when you change a watershed from forested conditions to development. And what happens is when you have a forested watershed, less than 1% of the precipitation is turned into surface runoff, whereas under development conditions, the same precipitation volume is turned into, or 20 to 30% of this volume of precipitation is turned into surface runoff. I won't belabor anymore this because you're familiar with these processes. But what I wanted to spend a little bit of time on is this conceptual model showing that under development conditions, large storms can cause some uptick in flow rates, but usually these spikes are moderate and gradual, happening over long periods of time. In contrast, under post-development conditions, the spikes are more pronounced, flows increase and recede rapidly, and even small storms can cause some spikes, whereas under forested conditions, the flow would have barely caused an uptick in the hydrograph. What this means is that you have a lot more erosive forces in the stream with more ability to mobilize sediment. I'm going to go a little bit in the weeds here, but we won't stay there for too long. We will call the flow needed to mobilize sediment as flow critical. And as you can see from the graph over here, there are times when the same storm that can cause some spikes in the hydrograph and some erosion under post-development conditions, but they would have not caused the same, they would have not had the same effect under forested conditions. What makes it tricky though is that this flow critical is different for different sediment size. And so as you can imagine, it takes a lot more flow to move a boulder down the stream than it does for a grain of sand. This is really, really important to understand because we are not only interested in sediment coming from upland, but we are also interested in erosion that is happening in stream. And this portion can actually represent a high source of sediment to the system. But this brings us to the main question that the TMDL can help us answer. Remember that the TMDL stands for the total maximum daily load. So, which means that we can expect the TMDL to tell us the maximum amount of a pollutant that a stream can handle and not be impaired. So one of the questions we can ask of this particular TMDL is, what is an acceptable level of fine sediment that supports the attainment of habitat, healthy habitat for benthic invertebrates? To answer this question, we are currently calibrating a watershed model. We are using HSPF that we will use to understand how to assign point sources like municipal stormwater permittees, non-point sources, and a small margin of safety. The allocations will be expressed in terms of pounds or tons per year of TSS, or total suspended solids. So it all sounds pretty straightforward, right? But going back to the question, you may want to know, how will we determine what an acceptable level of sediment is? As I just mentioned, the model expresses the outputs in terms of TSS, not BIBI. So we are working on that right now, and we're considering at least two approaches at this point. One approach is to use forested conditions. So we would ask jurisdictions to do work that would get the watershed to a point where the surface runoff is the same as it would under forested conditions. Remember the graphic I just showed, showing runoff at less than 1% of precipitation under pre-development conditions. That's what we're talking about. Then another option is to use reference streams to inform the ultimate goal of the TMDL. Reference streams are streams that are similar to those in the Sioux watershed, but where the BI threshold is met, is attained. We assume that they have sediment conditions that allowed for the attainment of BI threshold, but maybe under without necessarily being fully forested. So we would set the targets equal to sediment production in these streams after we adjust for some watershed differences like size, gradient, sediment type, land use, and maybe other characteristics. We are weighing different options right now. Another question the TMDL will answer is, how much work do we need to get us there? This question will be answered in the implementation plan that we will develop. This plan will list the types of BMPs that we will need to reduce fine sediment in the Sioux, and they will include BMPs that reduce runoff inputs to the streams, so flow control BMPs and low impact development BMPs, as well as BMPs that reduce sediment from upland. And next, we will combine, we're not just going to provide a list of these BMPs. We want to know what combination of these BMPs will get us there is an acceptable level of effort. So we will use them to build scenarios that estimate the level of effort needed to reach the optimal levels that the TMDL indicates for sediment production. So we will use a scenario development tool that we have recently acquired that goes hand in hand with HSBF. At this TMDL, this scenario building exercise is not something that we will do on our own. I'm hoping that we can work with local jurisdictions to design some of these scenarios because we want them to be informative for planning purposes. We don't know what they look like at this point, but we know that they will not be prescriptive. So the TMDL will not be prescriptive. So what I mean by this, we will not tell the permittees, you need to put this TMDL at this particular location, but we want to get an idea of what amount of work is necessary to get us there. So where are we at in the process? So far, our engineer has calibrated the HSPF for hydrology. We are now looking at what may be the best parameters for permittees and stakeholders to measure progress against throughout the implementation phase. High pulse counts is an option, but we are also looking at others that may be more easily monitored as well. And our engineer is in the process of calibrating the model for sediment. As I mentioned before, we are looking at both sediment from the watershed and produced through in-stream erosion. Also, as I mentioned, we have invested in acquiring a tool that will help us with the development of scenarios. And I see a lot of involvement from stakeholders at this stage, and I'm looking forward to productive dialogue between ecology and jurisdictions to develop these scenarios. And once we have a good handle of these scenarios, we will do some statistical analysis to help us understand the bounds of possible outcomes to make sure that the allocations of the TMDL will get us to the desired conditions. And hopefully they'll help us turn the corner and we're off to implementation. Now, I expect that the implementation will have a phased approach and that all this modeling work that we're doing right now will help us assign different levels of priority to different subbasins, and that implementation work will be informed by these priority levels. For instance, I'm sure that you would expect that the model will show us which portions of the watershed produce the most sediment. And that those will be the areas that will be addressed in a first phase, and then other portions of the watershed will be addressed subsequently in later phases. Hopefully this will get us to the final goal of restoration. But I do not want to oversimplify this process because I know that it will take a tremendous amount of work and resources, but I do want us to keep in mind the ultimate goal. I added a question mark here because we also have to remember that the stressor ID pointed not only to sediment and stormwater, but to habitat too. But while addressing the sediment, I want to leave you with this idea that while addressing the sediment may not be a sufficient condition to achieve the restoration goal, it is a necessary condition that must be addressed. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time and look forward to your questions.
Cleo, thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Stop sharing.
Terrific. Yes, thank you. That was really excellent. I mentioned in the chat for all y'all at the start of the presentation that we would track some questions coming in via the chat and that we would also use the raise hand function during the Q&A. So if at this point you have a question or comment, please go ahead and raise your virtual hand. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the placeholder comments that came in via the chat. Colin had a comment about the temperature and a couple questions, I believe, about DO and sediment. So let me pass the mic to Colin.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing.
I can take,
stop sharing.
I can take it back. Oh, there you go. Okay.
There we go. Sorry.
So I guess the first comment, Cleo, was just the comment you made at the beginning around the temperature TMDL. I would say we noticed the same effect. So it's not just a new issue as far as like the June, July time period. We looked through roughly 15 years of data and saw that June almost never met the temperature standard across that time frame. So just something to keep in mind that that's not just a recent phenomenon.
Yes, no, I think the problem was that the model that we had was focused on the critical period of summer, and the model that we did would only model one day in July. And so when we saw these problems in June, I guess we assumed that when they started the project, they had looked at the whole spectrum of temperature days. And so when we saw this problem in the shoulder periods, we realized, oh my goodness, we only have this model that models one day in July. That's not helpful for us for June and September. But it's good to know that there are data that support that.
Yeah. So we do have the long-term gauge down near the hatchery that the county has maintained that goes back to 94. So you could look at that if you wanted to sort of have at least some ability for a long-term trend.
Nice.
So Iris, did you want me to keep going down my other two questions, or do you want to try and go back and forth? So like have Mike ask a question.
So how about you take your first question about oxygen? We'll head over to Mike and then we'll come back to you for sediment.
Okay.
Keep things fair.
Yeah, I didn't want to dominate. I just threw my comments into the chat. So you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation about dissolved oxygen, yet dissolved oxygen did not show up as one of the stressors in the causal model. And I quite honestly don't know a lot about benthic invertebrates, but I would think they need a decent amount of oxygen like fish do. So with the Sioux Creek system having so many wetlands in it and having potentially lower dissolved oxygen as a natural background condition in much of its water, how come that wasn't evaluated or assessed as part of that stressors evaluation?
It was addressed. It was assessed.
Okay,
OPO was assessed. I'm not sure. I wondered about that myself, and the only thing that I could come up with was that the benthic invertebrates, I think, have they can handle. Well, they do need decent DO concentrations. Maybe they don't need them to be as high as salmonids. Yeah.
okay.
All right, let's head over to Mike, who's got his hand raised.
Thanks. And I'm interested in Colin's next question too. I see there, that's a good one.
Me
I guess
too.
thank you for the presentation, Cleo. It was very helpful, and I'm trying to get my head around TMDLs and what they mean for municipalities. I know, I'm pretty sure the Lower Green itself, aside from Seuss Creek there that you focused on, has a temperature TMDL.
Mhm.
I was talking to the county recently that they're doing some BIBI studies region-wide, throughout the county, and one of them is in Gilliam Creek and
Mhm.
in Tukwila here, which over the last 18 years has averaged an overall score of about 7, which is very poor. And I'm wondering, given those, like the temperature with the green and the low BIBI index in Gilliam and probably our other creeks.
Mhm.
And you were talking about an implementation plan for this Seuss Creek Basin, and I'm guessing my question is, what does that mean, and what should cities be doing to help address these TMDLs?
So as I mentioned, this is the first, it's considered a pilot TMDL because this is the first one we're doing in the state. And I'm not sure, it does take a lot of effort. So I'm not sure when we would be getting to Gilliam, for instance. But I think that there are lots of things that you could be doing before we end up doing a TMDL in Gilliam, if that would be the case ever. I think that what we're finding is, well, first we would have to, again, understand, we need a stressor ID to understand what are the causes, the likely causes of impairment in Gilliam. But at the same time, if you don't want to do a stressor ID analysis, we can also use our common sense until then, which tells us it's an urban stream. Again, you can walk through all of those causal pathways that the stressor ID has looked at, and if there are studies that point to where those pathways are lacking, then again, most likely it's going to be stormwater. So anything that will help control runoff during high and maybe sometimes even smaller rain events will be helpful. Low impact development is helpful, and BMPs that again control the sediment that goes into the stream would be helpful too. A TMDL would tell us for different particular subbasins, what is that ratio between the sediment that comes from the watershed and how much sediment is being produced in stream. But I don't know that we always need to have that level of precision. We can still do a lot of early action work in the meantime. Is that?
Yeah, that's good. And is there, I guess, kind of a basic question about TMDLs, and what is the regulatory framework that a TMDL creates?
It depends on the parameter. For instance, with temperature, most of the implementation would have to be done on a voluntary basis. And so you have groups like the ones that Katie put together in the green, right, to regreen the green. It takes whenever we have to rely on voluntary actions, it takes a long amount of time to persuade landowners to plant trees on their properties. But then we have other parameters, and also depends on the sources. So if we have point sources, whether it's for temperature, actually, even or DO or a stormwater, whenever we have a point source, then we can actually incorporate the waste load allocations that we assign to them in a permit, which a stormwater related permit. And so in that case, they're more enforceable, right? Because schedule you have that needs to be followed. You have to show progress. You have to submit annual reports and so on. So it's just like it's more easily trackable and more enforceable, because you have to be, then those waste load allocations become part of the permit, and you'll have to stick with it. Otherwise, you would be not in compliance with the permit.
Thanks, Cleo.
Mhm.
So Colin, I'll head back to you for your second question, which I think a couple of us are interested in. And anyone who's wanting to go after Colin, please go ahead and raise that virtual hand.
So it goes back to since you guys are focused on sediment, it's sort of that question of how do you really separate out the background condition in the Sioux Creek system, especially where it appears to have a basic high amount of fine sediments already, given the flat geomorphology, like just the geomorphology of the system, the fact that it has so many wetlands right down the stream channels, it implies that there's a lot of natural sediment. And so it just sort of has that, it feels a little odd, and that wasn't sort of addressed in the presentation as to how you sort of, are you just going to say a change in land use means an increase in sediment and it doesn't matter what the baseline was? It's just sort of in the sense of what's in the creek. Just trying to understand how you
Yeah, no,
how
that's
you
good.
deal with that.
Yeah, so one of the scenarios that we will build is for forested conditions. So fully forested will change all the land use from development or roads to forest. And then we see, okay, so how much is the Sioux's watershed producing under those conditions? And then we will look at, okay, so how much is it producing right now? And so we will have some sort of a baseline. The reason why we are looking at reference conditions as well and other options is because we may not necessarily shoot for retrofits that will get us to a pristine forested condition kind of a situation. We're looking at what amount of work and retrofit will be necessary for us to do so that the benthic invertebrates are no longer impaired. And so if I don't know at this point if we're going to get to what the model will tell us, but yeah, we are going to model forested conditions, and then that would serve as the baseline for the least amount that of sediment that the watershed would produce under pristine conditions. Does that make sense?
Sort of. I think also just the basic fact there's so much fine sediment naturally brings into question fine sediment being targeted as the stressor, when had it like that, just it just causes me a little pause to have that be a focus, shall we say, of what we need to fix, when it's hard to separate out what's anthropogenic from natural, and whether or not the system naturally might not have had high BI BI scores.
Yeah, so that's what we would be doing with the forested conditions. You have that will determine what would be produced under natural conditions, and then the difference between those forested conditions and the current conditions would be the anthropogenic influence, right? And so we wouldn't ask for implementation to get us to levels of sediment that would be below those forested conditions. So those forested conditions would definitely take into account the type of sediment that is present in the watershed, the geomorphology.
I'm going to draw folks' attention to the chat where Matt Knox has put in a comment about temperature. And Matt, I'll invite you to speak up and add more if you'd like, or to just verbalize what you've put in the chat.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, just I hear that we're looking for a parameter that we can monitor and try to figure out how to make improvements there in Seuss Creek. I guess I just keep thinking back that it seems like the temperature is the thing that your graph that you showed at the start definitely showed that the upper portion of the creek is the areas that where that temperature loading is really increasing, and I think that's maybe a more straightforward parameter that you can monitor that really points at where I think the major problems are coming in Seuss Creek. And so I just wanted to point that out. I know that there's you pointed it out earlier, but Meridian Valley Creek, I know it's it typically dries up in summer, at least in later summer. Same with the Lake Meridian outlet, but both of those are flowing extremely hot in the late spring when they're coming out. At least my anecdotal information is that might be one of the largest issues to focus on as far as improving water quality in Seuss Creek.
Yep, I agree. Yeah, that's why we're trying to we're not abandoning the temperature and DO work in the Seuss. We're going to continue with it.
Heidi, you have your hand up. You've been waiting pretty patiently. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I had two questions. I wanted to follow up on Mike's line of thinking, since we both kind of work in the implementation side of things and from the regulatory side. And when you're talking about waste load allowances and the permitting being a route through which some mandatory compliance could happen, I understand there's a very large voluntary component right now, but from looking forward to mandatory point of views, I just wanted to understand better types of allowances that we could be talking about. Currently, are waste load allowances mostly along the lines of specific pollutants? So,
Yes. Whenever we develop waste load allocations or load allocations, they're always related to a specific pollutant.
and those are just chemical, basically, as of right now. We don't do anything with like temperature. You said that one was voluntary.
It's voluntary. So if you have a point source, for instance, like if you have a wastewater treatment plant that discharges warm water into a stream, then we can address that through a permit, and then they will have to figure out changes to their operations or a way to reduce the temperature of their effluent into the stream. But if we don't have a single point source or these more better defined point sources, then we're left with what is called load allocations that are assigned to non-point sources. So these can be riparian buffers, maybe some in-stream work that that encourages the formation of cold water refugia and other improvements to the stream channel, but we cannot we can't put those in a permit and assign them to a particular source, more of a non-point issue.
Okay, and my second question was, so the TMDLs they are created on a sub-basin basis, or they're more generic, larger, bigger picture?
It depends. For instance, in Sioux, we are we're addressing the whole watershed. We're looking at all the main subbasins. But then in other TMDLs, maybe for instance, the Green River, we didn't, the analysis mainly focused on the main stem, and then we assumed certain inputs of temperature from different tributaries without doing an analysis on them. So it just depends on the TMDL, the approach that we decide that is most appropriate and that is the most efficient also, because as you can see, some of these TMDLs can take years and years to develop. And if we want to do too much, then they could take even longer. And so we kind of have to balance those two things.
That makes sense. And so for these ones that are controlled with the point source allowances, those, it's not like you have to wait for a study of each subbasin. There's just state regulations or county or.
Yeah, so for instance, if you have again, a wastewater treatment plant, then their operations and their discharges are regulated by a permit. Or you have municipal stormwater permittees, jurisdictions that are regulated by an MS4 permit. And so that's how the TMDL then informs how the requirements can be added into the permit. But if we are adding requirements into the permit, they have to be very well documented, and we have to have sufficient data to as the basis for those allocations. We can't because they become legally binding, and so we are exposing ourselves to a lot of legal issues if we don't do that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Gonna leave a little bit of space here in case folks have other questions. I have a question myself, but I'll save it for the end.
Okay. If you do have other questions and you'd like to talk to me one-on-one, I'm happy to do so anytime. So.
This is Catherine. Am I sounding weird still?
You are, but you're
Okay.
understandable. So if you would like, you can continue, and we'll all just try to keep a straight face. I'm sorry.
I wonder if you can use a call-in option.
Maybe I'll try that.
Okay, while Catherine calls in, I'll just go ahead and ask my question to give her some time. So I understand it's early in the process and that things are likely not set in stone, but I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about your vision for stakeholder engagement and how you'd like to see local jurisdictions engage in the process.
Yes, so we are, I am looking at probably December having a stakeholder meeting that would kind of bring people up to speed where we're at on in the development of the TMDL, and I'm hoping that this will set us up for future meetings in which we can say, we can talk more about what what different options are. For instance, I was talking about different scenarios and understanding that what are the implications for the different scenarios. So that's one way we're going to get stakeholder input. But I think that those kinds of discussions probably lend themselves to even smaller meetings, where we're going to have, I imagine, one-on-one discussions with the local jurisdictions, with the county. And yeah, I think that that there will be, I think that the stakeholder involvement and feedback from them will take different forms of engagement.
That makes sense. Thank you. So your timeline for the next steps are actually really short, right? Coming up in December.
Yes. Yes, we're shooting for submitting TMDL ideally by the end of next year, but we're not going to do that until we have support. We think that we're going to be definitely, the technical analysis should be done by then, but we want to be able to submit a TMDL that has large support for implementation. So that will take time, I imagine.
Thanks. Catherine, do you want to try your phone if you've been able to call in? You're muted at the moment. You can also send your question in chat. I like when folks get to speak up and ask their own questions, but in this
Yes.
case, I'm happy to read it out. Oh, hang on. Here we go. I think that's Catherine calling in. I just accepted a 425 number. Catherine, is that you?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
you sound so much better.
That's good. That's really great. Thank you. Let's see. I'm gonna pop in here. So
Oh, go ahead and mute
you know-
yourself on the computer so that we don't get dual audio there, if you don't mind.
okay. How's that sound?
Much better.
Perfect.
Okay. Cleo, and actually I think this is probably going to be for additional conversation one-on-one afterwards. But I'm interested particularly in the sediment piece of this and how ecology and EPA are looking at it from kind of a a geomorphological kind of natural process perspective, if that's part of this discussion. And the reason I asked that is when you showed the map of the BIBI scores and the southeast corner and sort of the urban areas and the agricultural areas had really low scores. One thing those two areas have in common is the lack of connection to the floodplain. So you tend to have these ditches, and with the ditches, and I'm more familiar with the urban creeks, you just don't have a balanced sediment regime, which means any amount of sediment coming from upstream, just doesn't get handled in a way, like you don't get the scour, the fill, and the cleaning that you would get if the creek were, or if the river were connected to the floodplain. So I'm just wondering, we've seen in urban streams where we've done restoration and we have connected the floodplain, we've actually seen fine sediment it's a very different dynamic in terms of how the stream can basically sort the sediment and manage the sediment. So the fine sediment tends to end up on the edges of the stream, and it doesn't embed the material in the center of the stream. So I was just wondering, do you have geomorphologists on board and sort of factor in the physical processes that manage sediment and temperature, actually, for that matter?
Great. No, I don't think that we are working with a geomorphologist, but I think that that's great input for implementation, and I would like to talk to you more about it.
Yeah, let's do that.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for your patience with the audio difficulties. I know it's kind of a pain to have to call in separately. Josh, you have your hand up.
All
right.
No, I'm
Josh.
kidding. I'm kidding. I had to do that, Catherine. I'm sorry. I couldn't resist. I was just, that's the only reason I rose my hand. I had to get that one in. Actually, first of all,
Josh.
Cleo, thank you so much. You've done such great work, and not just on Seuss, but Newaukum and the main stem. And so thank you so much. What Colin has done with me over the last 20 years is point in direction of where temperature problems are on the ground, so we can focus our revegetation efforts in those areas. So I just wanted to see if this the TMDL was going to be more site specific as in terms of where to do revegetation, large capital projects, wood placement, whatever you guys might think are those subbasins or those reaches that would be most benefited by restoration actions. That would be really helpful, especially since the subbasin is so huge. It would be nice to have something more myopic in our approach toward restoration over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think that we can talk about it. I think we probably, again, don't need to wait for the temperature TMDL to be done to start working. And I know that you are already working. I know the Green River Coalition are already working in the basin, and start filling in those gaps in the huge gaps in the riparian buffer. And I'd like to sit down with you and others and see what plans you have for restoration. And I think that there are lots of opportunities on public land where we don't have to maybe get as much involvement from, we don't have to do as much outreach as we would have to for private landowners. I know that there's the BPA line that maybe we can do something there. Probably we would have to wait for the TMDL for that. And so, yeah, I think that maybe the model that we already have, even though it's, it has its shortcomings, that could help us. We can look at the results so far and we can see, okay, where we can get the most bang for the buck. So we can still do a lot of things right now, but and not necessarily wait for the TMDL. Although the TMDL, I assume will have, we'll be able to incorporate a lot more factors that come from other sources, not just riparian buffer.
Thanks, Cleo. Other questions, comments before we wrap up here? I have to say I've heard 2 follow-up conversations kind of come out of this already. So thanks for a great discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity. Yes. And for sure, I'm sure we'll discuss more in the future. But feel free to reach out.
You're getting some applause via the reactions in the chat. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
And some actual applause from Matt Knox there. Really great presentation. Thank you again so much for coming to speak with us and for the discussion. I don't know about y'all in the group, but I could use a brief comfort break. So let's all take 2 minutes. We'll come back at 10:45 for our next presentation. Go ahead and take that time to get some water, let your brain digest everything you've just seen and kind of switch gears to a more fish-centric study coming up. All right, y'all, that was a short one. It's 10:45. So as you're coming back and getting set, I invite you all to join me in welcoming our next presenter, Chris Gregerson with King County Science. Chris, you can go ahead and start sharing your screen whenever you're ready. Chris is going to be describing preliminary results from recent pit tagging efforts to understand how Chinook use the lower green. And I have to say, I saw a brief kind of preview of this presentation a couple weeks ago. It is fantastic. There's a lot of really amazing data coming out of this. Just like we did with Cleo, Chris is going to save some time for Q&A at the end of his presentation. So again, you can feel free to use the chat to jot down your questions during the presentation, and I'll use that as a list to call on you during the Q&A session. You can also, of course, wait for the Q&A session and raise your hand virtually as we just did. So y'all have heard from Chris about this work before. He probably doesn't need more introduction than that. So without further ado, Chris, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Iris. Yeah, happy to finally be able to share some of this with you guys. I know I've kind of kept you updated a little bit throughout the spring and summer about how it's going. But yeah, we're finally to the point where we have some data coming out of it, and I'm happy to share with you guys. So just for those who aren't familiar with it, I'll just do a quick recap of the how we got to this point and how this project got started. So this was actually a near-term action submitted on behalf of Ryan 9 in 2018 to Puget Sound Partnership. The whole purpose of this study and the whole reason why we submitted it as an NTA is because the lower green has really been a gray area for us, and it's been that way for a long time. We've had really limited data to use to tell us how Chinook use this area, and there's been numerous fish surveys, both by us as well as some of my predecessors and other groups as well, that have provided useful data, but they tend to just be a snapshot of fish use and don't really give us much that's useful at the population scale. So, you know, things like electrofishing, which I've talked to you guys about before. It's great because you can see fish in real time using a certain habitat. But in order to understand things like how long the fish are staying there, how well they're surviving, you really need to catch the fish twice. And you either catch it once and mark it and then try to capture it again, which has been done in the past. And that's what these pictures here are. This was Tom Nelson back in the early 2000s, catching fish, applying a UV dye to them and releasing them, and then trying to catch them again in the Duwamish. Either that, or you catch them, you tag them somehow, and then you use a remote system like a pit tag array to detect them. And that was the purpose of this project. Now, the more traditional methods like screw trapping, and like the study that was done in the early 2000s, very low efficiency in the lower green, and they're also very expensive. And this isn't just unique to the lower green. This is common with trying to do these types of studies anywhere you have a river like this. So, you know, a slow, low gradient river where you can't really run a screw trap well, that, you know, you might not be able to do traditional types of work well. So that's why we proposed doing a pit tag study. And the reason why we pitched this, why we really needed this type of study, was because we're doing a lot of restoration in the lower green. And yet, like I mentioned, it's still a gray area for us. We really don't know if the fish are using this. So with as hard as it is for us to get the money for restoration, it is really important for us to spend it in the most effective way possible. And that was really the big pitch for this. The background work that led up to this was, as you guys are familiar with, this is the otolith work that DFW has done for us in the past. And we know that based on their work, the fish that are leaving and entering the Duwamish as fry are just not surviving to adulthood. So even though they're, you know, upwards of 50% of all of the juvenile Chinook in the river, they're only making up less than 5% of the adults. So we know that our adult returns are limited by how many of these bigger par that we can grow in the freshwater portions of the middle green and the lower green. And with that, we want to know, is the lower green helping to produce those par? And if so, can restoration in the lower green increase the number of par that can be produced, therefore boost our adult returns in the future? So to answer these questions and get at this big problem that we've been trying to solve, there's really two pieces of new technology that we wanted to test out with this project that would try to help us answer this. So the first one is new smaller pit tags. So traditional pit tags are around 12 millimeters. They've been used in fish as small as about 60 millimeters. So just for reference, that's a lot of times our cutoff between fry and par. So great for the out migrating par and smolts and things like that, where it's really commonly used. But if we're curious about those really small guys, less than 60 that we know are not surviving, we needed something smaller. And so in the last 5-6 years, these have been become available for us. So these are capable of tagging fish as small as 45 millimeters, which is really small for these juvenile Chinook. The other part of this study, which is kind of the heart of the entire proposal, is this new West Fork fin array. So I've mentioned this to you guys before, call it the barge, the antenna, the array, but this is the big pontoon that is anchored down in Tukwila right now. And this is what is detecting all of these tags. Now, what makes this special is that it's on a floating platform with antennas suspended vertically down into the water column. The way that these antennas are built, they can shed debris and not break. So you can kind of see in this picture, there's these cables going down. So each one is on a winch system. They have a quick release on them and they're buoyant. So let's say a a 50-foot cottonwood comes down the river and plows right into the front of this thing. The quick releases will pop open, the buoyant fins float to the top. It's hooked to a cellular modem, so I get a message that the antennas are out of tune, and then I can go out and redeploy them. Now on a more traditional pit tag array, it's really hard plastic antennas that have to be anchored to something very secure. They're not very mobile, they're not very dynamic, so they don't work great if you have big changes in water surface elevation like you do the lower green. They're also susceptible to debris, which, spring out migration in the lower green, there's plenty of that. So this new floating array, it sheds debris well and it stays on the surface, so you're always getting good detection of those surface oriented juvenile salmon. So with that said, the questions that we tried to answer that we proposed for the NTA was, one, is this pit tag technology useful for Puget Sound rivers? It has been tried a couple times in the Columbia River Basin, and it has been used successfully, but it's never been tested before until now in Puget Sound. So the first part's obviously a proof of concept. There's a ton of places in Puget Sound that have the same kind of monitoring issues that we do. So we wanted to make sure that this was an effective tool for everybody. Second, like I said, the lower green is a gray area for us. So we really wanted to hammer the question, are the fish actually staying here or are they passing through? And then on top of that, if we can answer it, are the Chinook that we are detecting passing through surviving through the lower green? So in addition to this, I know I talked to you guys about it. Once we got the grant, you guys chipped in some funding just as a partner study. So, obviously we have all these tagged fish we're going to be releasing in the river. Well, this was a great chance to take advantage of that and provide some additional information. So we were able to put antennas in Mill Creek and Midway Creek. Obviously, as you guys know, and as I've told you in the past, really important non-natal habitat for juvenile Chinook. So we were hoping that by putting antennas there, we might be able to better understand how the fish use them, since we're going to have so many tagged fish out there. We also, from this, we can understand how long those fish are actually staying there. So here's kind of just a big overview for you guys on the approach for how we did this project. So the red star down here this is how we are going to get our fish tagged in the river. So we have the DFW screw trap. It's located at the lower portion of the middle green. And this served as a great opportunity to tag natural origin fish. So they're constantly trapping on a daily basis. And since they're already catching these fish and they're spending every day out there trying to do it, it saves a ton of time on our part if we can actually put tags in those fish and then release them downstream. So they serve two purposes, and it works out great for everybody. So that was the bulk of our tagging, was at the WDFW screw trap. We also did seining, boat electrofishing, backpack electrofishing, and fyke netting, just to try to any way we could to get our numbers up in that area. Now it's not exactly the upstream extent of the lower green, so we do have a short portion of habitat here in between the screw trap and the lower green proper. So there is a little bit of bias there, but given the overall size of the lower green basin, we hope that the results are more reflective of the lower green experience versus, just this really short section of habitat here. Yellow star here is the barge located in Tukwila. And to test how well the barge worked, this green star here is where we would release 250 tagged hatchery Chinook every week for 10 weeks. And this would just allow us to release a known quantity of fish just upstream of the barge, and then see how many the barge was able to detect and give us a % efficiency. And the idea being that, you're close enough to the barge where it's unlikely that you're going to have significant mortality of your released fish, but far enough upstream where the fish can disperse evenly throughout the river. And so you'll get consistent detection rates that might be more representative of fish in the wild. The blue stars here are the tributaries that I mentioned. So we actually went into the tribs and captured and tagged fish that we knew were rearing there, and then had our antennas on Midway and Mill Creek so we could detect the fish leaving as well as fish from the main stem that might be coming in. In addition to that, we also, the river section, installed an antenna at the Twofold Large Woods site. So there's a total of 7 antennas out there on a solar system to see how fish were utilizing that habitat. All right, so back to this spring. This was March 2021. We finally got the barge ordered, we got it delivered, and we got to put it in the river. So first picture here, the only place that we had room to actually assemble it was at First Ave in downtown Seattle. So we put it together there on the boat ramp. Muckleshoot Tribe let us store it at their dock. And then we used 2 boats and pushed it 9 miles up the river to the city of Tukwila. And here is a picture right here of anchoring the barge. So we worked with the city of Tukwila and their bridge engineer to come up with a plan to anchor it from the bridge piers, which actually is probably the best way to anchor something like this. So you have your attachment points in the air so that any debris that comes down the river can go underneath the barge without any obstructions. Whereas if this was on an anchor system, you could have debris that would could destroy or pull out the anchors. As for the site-specific antennas that were funded through Raya 9 and the River's Twofold antenna, these were solar-powered standalone units. So you have, for example, the Twofold array here. This is solar-powered. In this job box, you have a series of batteries that are maintained by the solar panels, as well as your controller and reader for the antennas. And then you have a series of these high-density polyethylene tubes. Each one of these has loops of wire in it that act as the antenna, and these are anchored in the stream and with wires running back to the reader. Mill Creek, we devised some antennas on floating platforms because we were about 50 meters upstream of the mouth where the water elevation changes pretty drastically. So we anchored them from a high line, and they were able to float on the surface with the changing water levels and worked really well. Midway Creek, these are the antennas that we installed out there, being a really small system. Just these simple rectangular antennas worked well. Once the antennas were in, we got to start tagging, and we tagged a lot. So the method that we used were these preloaded needles from Biomark. So each one of these needles is surgically sharpened and sterilized and comes with a tag on the inside. You use this yellow implant gun to push the tag through the needle and into the fish. So after you tag, it just leaves just the tiniest little incision here. The tag is pushed towards the tail to avoid any of the organs, and it's done at a sharp angle like this to prevent that needle from penetrating down into the abdominal cavity where the organs would exist. Then we would hold the fish in a tank for 12 to 24 hours before being released. Ideally, they would be released at nighttime if there were no water quality concerns, just to make sure that the fish had the best chance possible and they weren't released when they're disoriented or could be vulnerable to predation. All right, so from the tagging results, what have we learned? So like I mentioned, we were tagging at the screw trap. Between the screw trap, fike nets, and all the other methods that we were implementing to catch fish there, we were able to get tags in 953 wild fish, which I'm very happy with. It took a ton of effort and a lot of creativity on both our part and DFW's to get that. So all things considered, that was I was pretty happy with being able to get close to 1,000. We also obtained a lot of fish from Seuss Creek. So over 3,000 hatchery fish that we tagged, both for the efficiency trials to test the barge, but we were also able to do a release group at the screw trap as well. So we could compare the wild fish and hatchery fish as they move through the entire lower green. Now, one question you might have is, is this harmful to the fish? And we're really fortunate. We only got a 0.1% mortality rate from tagging. So that's, within 24 hours. It is possible there could be some really long-term effects, but from the literature, it seems that if the tag mortality occurs, it's generally going to be, in the first couple hours. So very happy with that. Now, into the actual results, the first row here, this is our releases at the pedestrian bridge in Tukwila for our efficiency trials. So 0.4 miles upstream, we released 2,471 fish. Like I said, 250-ish per week for 10 weeks. And we detected 218 of those. So that's an average detection rate of 8.8%. That is awesome. Really happy with that. Just for comparison, the DFW screw trap gets about 3% efficiency. So, having close to 9% efficiency for a low gradient section of stream like the lower green, stoked with that. That's awesome. Now, the not so great of the fish, the wild fish and hatchery fish we released at the screw trap, we only detected 22 of the wilds and 13 of the hatcheries. So that's 2.5% for wild, 1.6% for hatchery. Definitely not the 8.8% that we expected. Now we were able to tag some fish in the lower green tribs as well. So a total of 90 there, 4 detections at the barge, but can't say much from 4 detections. That's a really low number to be making any inferences about their detection rate. So looking into that discrepancy here, the 2.5 and 1.6%, that the idea with the efficiency trials is that once you understand how well the barge works, you can apply that to your tag numbers further upstream and have kind of a number of detections that you would expect based on that efficiency. So based on what we expected, we thought we would get 76 wild, 71 hatchery fish, but in actuality, it was 22 and 13. So using the efficiency that we got from the barge, you can calculate a theoretical survival rate through the lower green, and that comes out to about 29% for wild and 18% for hatchery fish. Now, one thing to mention is that for the efficiency trials, we are using hatchery fish and they're being released for the first time in the river 0.4 miles upstream of the barge. So there could be behavioral differences between, fish that have been in the river for 22 miles versus ones that are just released. On the other hand, DFW did some trials this year to test efficiency between wild and hatchery fish, and didn't come up with any major differences for the screw trap. So it's likely that both of those issues are having an impact, but being that this difference is so drastic, it's very likely that we're having some mortality issues through the lower green. Okay, looking at some of our detection data. So one of the big takeaways from this project is that yes, these juvenile Chinook are spending considerable time in the lower green. On this chart, you have down here on the x-axis, this is fish length. So you're going from down here at 47 millimeters, which is the smallest fish we tagged, upwards closer to 90. And then on the y-axis, you have the residence time. So this is for the difference between when they were tagged and when they were detected. So theoretically, the time that they spent in the lower green. Overall, the mean was about 19 days for this group of fish. You can definitely notice this kind of wedge shape here, with the smaller fish tending to stay longer than the larger fish. So if you divide this in the middle, everything less than 65 millimeters, that's an average of about 28 days spent in the lower green. Whereas fish that are bigger than that was an average about 11. So this is huge. This is telling us that, yes, fish are definitely spending time in the lower green, and it varies significantly. So, you know, obviously you have the two smallest fish tagged spending the longest time, but you also have these fish that spend, you know, 4 days. So it's likely that some are able to find habitat while many aren't, but also the smaller fish are definitely spending more time there. So we know that, yes, it is important to do restoration down here and that it's meaningful, but these are the fish that we should be most concerned about. Especially if these fish are just passing through, or if they are actually able to use the main stem lower green for habitat. Now onto the hatchery fish, same thing. You have length down here, and on the y-axis you have the residence time. So you can see that for the most part, most of the hatchery fish pass through pretty quick. You have one outlier up here that was close to 2 months. But keep in mind, these are all fish that are greater than 60 millimeters. So you don't have the size distribution that you have with the wild fish. They tended to be a little larger, so you could be seeing that. Overall, though, it was an average of 9.6 days. I wanted to include this also because I thought this was really interesting. So of the 2,000 fish that we released for the efficiency trials in Tukwila, 204 of the detections, the overwhelming majority, passed by the barge in about 3 hours average. So released 250 fish, 0.4 miles later down the river, which took them about an average of 3 hours, boom, they're detected. Now, on the other hand, 14 of those fish, which was 6% of all the detections, decided to camp out in Tukwila. So this group here, which was 14, had a mean residence time of 46 days in Tukwila. And all of these fish, if you'll notice, are smaller than 65 millimeters. So these were all fish that were released April 28th and earlier, as early as mid-March. So, you know, what is this telling us here? I mean, it's only 6%, but interestingly enough, these fish are spending considerable time and they are finding places to live in the lower green around Tukwila. Now, you have Gilliam Creek that's right in the reach. It was in between the barge and the release location. So you have that potential. You know, these fish could also be moving upstream or downstream. But one thing to note here also is we didn't have any of the large high flow events that we typically do in the rearing period. So flow is generally below about 2000 CFS, which can have something to do with this. Onto the two full antenna structure. Like I said, we had 7 antennas here, and they were scattered from the upstream end of the large wood site down to the bottom. So the idea being that we could detect fish moving through it and understand how long they would be able to stay there. So the whole year, out of the 1,725 fish that we released upstream, including hatchery and wild, we only detected 8 fish actually using the two full wood structure. Now, we can't say that only 8 fish used it because we definitely don't have a perfect detection efficiency. The antennas are these rigid plastic rectangular antennas again, and their read range is only about 18 inches to 2 feet. So fish have to get fairly close. They also change effectiveness with water elevation. So I had to go out weekly and adjust them up and down the bank to make sure that they were always in the water and close to the margin where fish would be. Now, of the 8 fish detected, 4 were hatchery and 4 were natural. 2 were detected going upstream and 2 were detected going downstream for each, or for the 4 fish that were detected on multiple antennas. I thought that was pretty interesting, especially this upper one here, which was detected traveling across the entire system, moving upstream in about 3 minutes. So that might give us some insight, that maybe these fish aren't just making a single linear migration out. Maybe it is a series of upstream and downstream movements looking for habitat, and finding different places to meet their needs throughout the season. Who knows? It could also be inside something's stomach, so we can't say. The longest that a fish stayed here was about 6.5 hours. Now, again, we can't say that's the longest that any fish would use it, but that's the longest that was detected for any tagged fish that we have. So again, without having, additional study locations that aren't on the wood structure, say, on the opposite bank, we can't really make comparisons to non-restored habitats with this. It's just providing us insight to how the fish are using it. Onto the tribs. So you guys are, I'm sure, very familiar with all the trib work, and all I've been blabbing about it over the years. So the tributaries, though, once again proved to be very valuable. So we were able to tag 32 fish in Midway Creek, and we detected 81% of those leaving. They all left around early May. So those antennas are not 100% efficient either, and we weren't able to test their efficiency, but knowing that 81% of the fish we tagged were detected is great. So that's telling us at a bare minimum, that's how many survived the time in the stream. We only tagged 5 in Mill Creek, and this has been an ongoing issue, but out of all of the available stream that we had to sample, we were only able to get 5. And that's been the case for the last couple of years. It's just the numbers seem to be very low. They are in there, just again, really low numbers, and something to look into in the future. We also tagged a whole bunch in Mullen, and we focused on this because in the past it has been a hot spot. We couldn't put an antenna there though, just due to all the local activity and the risk that the antenna would turn up missing. So we did tag fish there though to see how well they fared to the barge, and we ended up only detecting 2 of those at the barge. Again, low enough detections that we can't really make any meaningful inferences about that. One of the big takeaways from this, though, is that none of the fish we tagged in the river were actually detected moving into these tributaries. So while we can't say for sure, again, because we didn't tag all the fish, but this suggests that the fish that were in the tributaries were very likely fish that got in very early in the year. So before we started tagging late January, early February during the high flow events, it's likely those fish got in there and stayed put. And then once the water dropped, potentially occupied all that available habitat, and they were the only fish that that we found in there, none from the river. And what good pit tag study would be complete without a couple of random fish? So I just wanted to include these because I thought they're pretty interesting. So 2 fish, both released on April 14th of 2021 as part of efficiency trial. Got a call from DFW that one of these tags was found in a blue heron's nest at the Ballard Locks this summer. So they were able, just because of how our tags are, the new 9mm tags, they were much smaller than all the other tags that they found in the nest. So it was easy to pick out. Based on this too, we were working with Port of Seattle and hoping to get up on Terminal 106 soon. We know there's a Caspian tern colony up there, and they're kind of like mountain lions to juvenile Chinook. So we're hoping that we can try and get up there and see if there's any of our tags up there. So stay tuned for that. Now, another hatchery Chinook that was also released on that same date. This was one of the ones that just decided to park in Tukwila. So detected him 45 days later. The really interesting part, though, is that from that time we detected him, he was detected 382 more times at the barge over about the next 2 weeks. So I thought for sure he had like died and washed up on the barge. But looking at the results from the barge output, you could see that he was being detected on different antennas. So the fish was alive and moving around. And after the 13 days that he was there, I was finally able to look at the data. And interestingly enough, he hung out underneath the barge all day. So he'd show up about 5 in the morning and ping around on different antennas throughout the day and then disappear at about 9:30 p.m. and wouldn't get any detections at night, and then show up again at 5 a.m. the next morning. So hard to say it's one single fish, but it's potential that, he thought the barge was good overhead cover. Obviously you have the fins there that are providing a nice current break, so might have been a good spot to feed, but pretty interesting, and glad that we can at least provide habitat for one fish with our study. So in the context of salmon recovery, like I mentioned, these results say that yes, habitat restoration in the lower green is worthwhile. So it's great to know that we're on the right path. And, with some of this data too, it's good to know that the types of habitat we're building to support those small Chinook is definitely where we need to be spending our money. So off-channel, slower areas. So projects like Downey, these results speak highly that projects like Downey are going to be successful for salmon recovery. This also speaks to the tributaries too, that tributary restoration and access is important. We know that those tribs are growing the par that are going to survive to adulthood. This study, though we did not expect it, it does highlight some looming survival issues. This could potentially be huge issues that have gone overlooked in the past. So it is definitely something that we want to turn our sights towards in the future. So from here, next year, we have a habitat use study that will be happening in the lower green. So this will be using our cataract, like you see here in this picture, to really look at the specific habitat types that are available and how fish are using them in the lower green. So this helps us kind of fine tune our knowledge of how fish use the lower green. So, we know that the fish are using it from this study. Now, go in a little bit further and see, specific habitat types, what they're using, and build off some of that data that was collected in 2014 during the retrospective study. Following up on that in 2023, hopefully we can try to repeat this study again on the green. And knowing now what we know, it would be great if we could actually look into this survival issue a little bit more. So just some examples of ways we could do that. We could release tag fish throughout the basin and see if there are any specific locations we're losing fish, if it's an even rate. Also, like I mentioned a little bit ago, we didn't have any high flows during this study. So generally, everything was below about 2000 CFS. And, historically, it gets up higher than that. And we all know that, these fish tend to move during high flow events. And, it could be that these spring high flow events are what actually successfully push the fish out of the system, or that the fish actually use to out migrate safely. So like to collect some data from these high flow events and see if survival changes or residence time migration. So just like any study, it gives us a whole pile of new questions, but we're on the right track and we're getting close to having the answers that we need. So with that, thank you guys for your time, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Chris. I feel like I got even more out of that the second time I saw it. We will take a few extra minutes here for questions. And I think, let's see, Mira has a question in the chat. Mira, if you'd like to unmute and go ahead and expand.
Sure. I wanted to know for 2023 if you have specific locations in mind, if you're thinking of repeating some of the previous ones, or if you are recruiting sites to put the arrays at.
Yeah, so no hard plans yet. I would love to actually talk to you guys a little bit more and kind of bounce some ideas around. Obviously, we have these antennas. You know, Ryan 9 has paid for them, so we can kind of brainstorm some ideas on where would be best to put them. When I started this study this spring, I tried doing some sampling in Riverbend and Lieber, as well as some other projects, but you know, I had to kind of move away from that just because I wasn't catching enough fish to where I would get meaningful detections. So I kind of, instead of spreading out all of these locations, I decided to consolidate and put all my eggs in a couple baskets. But um, yeah, knowing that, we can talk more and come up with some ideas on where to put these things in 2023.
I've written that down as a follow-up. Katie, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Iris. Chris, I just had a question about, you know, the next time you repeat the study and thinking about how you said you miss all the kind of high flow events but also recognizing that you can't tag fish until they're a certain size. And so just wondering, you know, I guess, you know, I'm also really curious about, you know, gathering more data about, you know, usage of those tributaries, but it sounds like it may not be possible to tag them earlier. So the fish that are actually, you know, accessing those tributaries in January. So just curious about, you know, how you'd approach gathering data on those high flow events and also the tributary access when you might not be able to tag them until later in the season.
Yeah, you bring up a great point too. So yes, we can tag fish down to our comfortable limit was 47 millimeters. So below that though, we couldn't really tag anything, and that's missing a huge chunk of the fish that are leaving. So the big pulses of fry that leave early in the year, you know, late January, end of February, we completely miss those and we're not able to tag them. So we can only speculate as to what happens to them based on where we find them. But we have to kind of turn our attention towards, you know, the fish that we know are not surviving, the less than 60 fish, and see what's happening with those. But yeah, to get back at your question, we really couldn't start tagging fish well until end of March and into early April. So that's when on average they were a little bit bigger. And it varied too. Some of the tributaries, the fish got bigger a lot faster. So we found those early in the spring, but in the main stem, they stayed small for a while. The folks at the trap also said too, the water temperature this year kind of contributed to that slower growth rate. But it's really hard to say. So we'll just do the best we can with what we have, and that's all we can do.
Colin's got his hand up.
Hey, Chris, given the comment about like Downey and other sites, originally for the previous grant, you were hoping to buy more arrays, but they turned out more expensive than you had hoped for. With the upcoming attempt at a new study, could you put some just ballpark estimates as to how much some of the arrays cost, so that we could think about just how much more resources we'd want to try and find if we were to try and expand the existing equipment you have? So adding more of the arrays like you had for, say, Midway or Mullen. So you could add, say, an upstream, downstream one to Downey's inlet and outlet, or so something like that, where we could really expand the number of secondary sites.
Yeah, good question. So the antennas varied widely depending on the power source. So if you have 120 volt power somewhere nearby, a full system might be $5,000 to $10,000. If you don't, you have to rely on solar panels and gigantic AGM batteries, and that drives the price up to more like $20,000 to $30,000 per full antenna system. Now, like the two full array was 7 12-foot long antennas spaced on a 250-foot bank. It's massive, and that one was closer to $80,000 for the entire thing. So just to give you kind of ballpark of what it looks like.
Thanks.
So y'all, I'm aware we're running into towards the end of our meeting time. I'm happy to let questions continue if you have anything pressing, but I'd also like to open the floor for you all to start providing your roundtable updates and any requests or suggestions that you might have for future meeting topics. Please feel free to go ahead and raise that virtual hand, raise your real hand. At this point, if you'd like to, you can simply unmute yourself and start speaking, and we'll sort it out if too many people do that at once, but I don't think it's going to be a problem. Go ahead. Susanna.
Hey, I just wanted to let folks know that at the next ITC, we will be sending out the request for proposal materials to you for review and approval. So be looking for those. That's for 2 of our grant programs, the Regreen the Green, as well as the monitoring and research RFP. So I'll be really looking for your thorough review on that in anticipation of approval in November. So just wanted to give you a wide heads up on that.
Thanks, Susanna. And Chris, I want to make sure you get a chance to look at the chat because you're getting some really nice compliments in there. Other roundtable updates, requests for future meetings?
I can just add that many of you probably saw a email from myself about a regional support letter for downstream fish passage at Howard Hanson. I've been in conversations with Tacoma Water, and they are pushing for a letter. They are in working with the Corps. They think there may be a pathway for accessing funds via the infrastructure bill, which has about $1 billion for Army Corps, but it's not allocated to specific projects. And if successful, it would actually, there's language in there that would allow them to circumvent the traditional 902 reauthorization process. So Tacoma's looking to put together this regional support letter. For those of you on that list, it would be great. We've already gotten a number of partners to sign, but the intent is for it not to be a RIA letter, but rather a regional letter that the representatives are signing on behalf of their city, not kind of the RIA. So we have a number of them already moving forward, but if for your respective organizations, if you could help out and push that along, that would be great.
Thanks, Matt.
I just wanted, I think that most folks in this meeting are aware, but just to, if you're not, we are hearing that the next kind of public scoping notice for the Lower Green River Corridor Plan is going to be released in the next, I'm guessing, couple of weeks. We were hearing late October, early November. And I know many of you in this group were very involved back in 2018. So that's all I know at this point.
Thanks, Katie. Any final roundtable updates, things that we need to all hear as a group?
This is Mike. One thing I just wanted to bring up was the Riverton Creek project is basically done. We're just kind of struggling through the final bits, but the fish passage component is complete, and wasn't sure where we left off with future studies of the fish use there, but just wanted to let everybody know that that's complete and would be interested in getting an idea of how the fish are using the project.
Fantastic. Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a quick Black River update. So I've been working with the Black River crew on fish passage updates for the new redesign that's going on. So right now, obviously, we have Jacobs who are leading the effort on that, but We are working on a contract right now to get a new updated fish counter, adult fish counter on the current ladder system. It would be a sonar based counter. So we would actually get some good data on what species are using it and when versus, just the click button for something went through the fish ladder. So hopefully we're going to get that in here in the next couple of months and get some new data on what's going into the Black River system.
Terrific. Colin?
I was just going to ask Chris, based on the workshops that were done for the Black River pump station, is there any information on, have they changed their sort of initial design approach? Or are they still trying to deal with all the feedback they got? I don't remember how many months ago now. Just curious because I haven't heard a peep as to any kind of direction that they're taking with design.
No updates for that yet. And part of trying to get this adult fish counter in there is to try and provide some more data. So hopefully if they can have some data on what species are using it and when, that they would be able to tailor the design a little bit. I'm not sure how much it would actually change, but no updates on alternative selection yet.
And that's intended to only capture adults versus, say, juvenile Chinook trying to use it as a non-natal area?
Yes.
All right, y'all. Seeing no other hands, and since we're a couple minutes over time, so thanks for your extra time today. Let's go ahead and wrap up. If you have any additional questions or, oh, sorry, Catherine, I saw you unmuted yourself and
Hi.
it was one of the phone numbers, and so I wasn't totally certain it was you. Go ahead.
That's okay. Thanks. Just a quick mention that there's a tributary to Midway Creek near the landfill that has a fish passage issue, and that SPU is working on getting a project manager to lead the effort to do a passage, a barrier removal.
Thanks, Catherine. How about I just take a breath in case anyone else has any last minute thoughts to share?
Catherine, if you need any assistance or information, Chris and I have all sorts of information we can provide to help whoever the new project manager is for that project.
Terrific. All right, y'all. If any additional questions, comments, or thoughts come up, please reach out. I'm happy to connect anyone who needs connecting. I've got a few follow-ups here, so you'll see emails from me making sure you each have those follow-ups as well. I want to thank our presenters today for fantastic presentations and some really great engaged discussions. It was really, really terrific. I learned a lot. And I want to thank you all for being here today. I appreciate your time, especially the extra 5 minutes at the end. We can look forward to seeing each other at the November meeting, where we're going to hear about the Harbor Island dock removal project and the water quality benefits evaluation toolkit. And as Susanna brought up, we'll be discussing those upcoming grant timelines and RFPs. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your days, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.